Thank you for joining us today as the ACS Surgeon Wellbeing Work Group begins a month of content focused on well-being and resilience around Physician Suicide Awareness Day on September 17th. I'm Dr. Michaela Escabella, Clinical Assistant Professor of Surgery at Stanford University. Our discussion today focuses on how the University of Colorado introduced well-being initiatives and resources to its residency training program to support the needs of its resident surgeons during a critical time in their professional development. Today, we are joined by Dr. Richard Schulich, the Aragon Gonzalez QC Chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and the Director of the CU Cancer Center. Thank you for being here. As well as Dr. Mark Neller, the Program Director for Surgical Residency, Professor of Surgery, and the Vice Chair of Education at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Thank you for being here, Dr. Neller. And Dr. Kashama Jaiswal, the Associate Program Director for Surgical Residency and Associate Professor of Gastrointestinal Surgery, Trauma, and Endocrine Surgery at the University of Colorado and Denver Health. So thank you all so much for being here and sharing your expertise today. To start us off, Dr. Jaiswal, can you please give us an overview of the program and your well-being initiatives?
Sure, thank you for having us. I have a few slides to share. So this is sort of a broad overview of our program, and we have some common programming for all of our levels, including community building events for all levels, as well as financial wellness for our R2s and our R3s. We have leadership training for our R3s and R5s. And we also have some unique programming based on the R levels, such as an intern coaching program and an intern and R5 mentorship pairing program. For the R2s, we do a communication workshop to help them prepare for some difficult conversations that they will face with the families in the ICU. For research residents, we host a weekend retreat in the mountains at Estes Park. And for the R4s, we host a retreat to help them prepare for fellowship interviews or job interviews that they will be encountering shortly after that. So a little bit more about our coaching program, which is in its second year. The coaching program is a longitudinal, goal-oriented, and learner-driven process. It helps foster self-reflection and professional identity and improves short-term and long-term performance for our interns. And it complements some of the things that we already do in GME training. So this is an overview of the coaching program as a whole. We start the coaching program shortly after they've matched with us, and we do a 30-minute intake interview where we discuss their strengths and their challenges. We also discuss any medical or mental health needs that they may have so that we can proactively guide them to the resources that they need as they move to Denver. And we want to make sure that they're established with care in whatever fashion they need so that they can hit the ground running come June. We also ask them to do some self-assessments that we discuss at the August workshop, and then the interns are paired with an individual coach to develop an individual learning plan and meet with their coach at least 4 times per year, sometimes more. Sometimes our various interns will need to meet more, and we have that throughout the rest of the year. Our Estes Park retreat that we concentrate our research residents for includes a community building programming, as well as stress management, managing difficult situations. We talk about goals and values for short-term and long-term goals. We also, of course, take advantage of our outdoor environment and participate in hiking and archery, as well as some art therapy with ceramics and mosaics. Other events that we do for everyone include developing holiday treats for all of our residents, including baked items and, of course, hand sanitizer. For Resident Appreciation Week, we distributed some caps. We also developed a fertility and family planning seminar based on resident request. We also have a resident to medical student mentorship program that was developed last year by one of our interns, and that has benefits, again, both for the mentee and the mentor. We have a longstanding muffins and meditation program run by one of our trauma surgeons, where residents do a 10-minute silent meditation, as well as discuss some difficult topics in a space where it is a safe space. Supportive measures for everyone. We advocate for a wellness half day throughout the year, twice per year, to make sure that our residents have time to attend routine appointments on a Monday through Friday basis. We've had many residents take advantage of maternity as well as paternity leave over the last many years. Over the last 5 years, we've had at least 10 residents take advantage of this. And for such a large program, we think that this is an amazing support for our residents. We also make sure our residents have access to our student and resident mental health clinic on campus, as well as access to our expanded mentorship program. And of course, residents love food. And so we try to get surprise breakfasts or lunches at various sites. And this was a definite winner, especially during COVID. Other offerings that we have done in the past include cognitive behavioral therapy for our interns, as well as during the pandemic, since in-person events were less accessible, we paired up with UCSF Center for Mindfulness and with Dr. LeBers to provide enhanced stress resilience training online for the residents who wanted it. We also hosted a suicide awareness grand rounds that one of our residents who's very passionate about this particular project gave recently. So that's sort of a broad overview.
Wonderful. Dr. Jaiswal, thank you so much for sharing the highlights. These initiatives, they're critically important, and it's really fantastic to see a residency program prioritize them in the way that all of you are. I'd like to ask you all just some additional questions. And I guess to start us off, first for Dr. Neller as program director, how has the inclusion of the Wellbeing initiatives benefited the residency training program as a whole and helped it evolve?
Well, I think we've been able to evolve into a family-oriented program. So people, by the time they're senior residents, often have children. So we've been able to continue people's lives in parallel with their training. I think that's been very important. I think the other thing is we've increased awareness. And so it's much more on the forefront. It's things that get talked about routinely. It's sort of a village. So if we have somebody that we're worried about, it's often brought up to us by, other faculty or even co-residents that there might be an issue. And so people are much more willing to get engaged. And we've also been much more willing to have residents themselves come out and say, listen, I need help about this or that issue. So it's really transformed our program to one where, it's not about like you need to tough it out and get through all this, but it's much more, we're here to help you. I mean, if you look at our program, it's a 7-year program. That's a long time. And it's during key parts of residents' lives where there's lots of other things that are happening in the background that are important for them, in addition to learning to be excellent surgeons. So I think it's been a culture-changing series of events.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that tends to be a common thread, is that the entire system has to have a shift in its culture, right? And that's really, really wonderful to hear. Dr. Jaiswal, what kind of feedback have you all received from resident surgeons about the Wellbeing programs or some of these initiatives?
Many of the programs that we have instituted have been instituted at the request of residents, and so we think we have the pulse, of our residents, and we listen to their feedback and add or subtract programming as they give us responses for. So the fertility planning seminar was requested from one of our female residents, and we found another 15 residents who were very interested in trying to figure out how to maintain their fertility in the long run. And so that's how we started that program. And so I think it requires us as leaders to listen to our trainees.
And that brings up my next question too, in terms of how do you involve residents either in the development? You mentioned that one example with fertility, but in the development and even leadership of this wellness program. Are they kind of intimately involved, and how does that work?
So we have a administrative chief resident sort of structure where we have 2 administrative chief residents at the R4 level and at the R5 level, and we have an administrative chief resident at the research resident level. And so those are sort of our resident representatives when it comes to running ideas by them. And so they help us filter through like, that doesn't sound like a good idea, or this sounds like a fantastic idea. And then in planning the actual events, we use the people who are interested in those specific topics to help plan and recruit other residents who are interested in those.
Wonderful. In this question for Dr. Jaiswal or Dr. Neller, what kind of resources and support do you offer residents experiencing suicidal ideation or residents experiencing distress that may not be suicidal ideation? I know you brought up that that grand rounds on physician suicide, which is so, so important. But are there any specific resources, or how do you all deal with this?
Well, typically, our goal is to be relatively preventative and working on maintenance. And so we have a nice relationship with our psychiatry department. And I think that's one of the themes of building wellness is you really have to collaborate. Many of the people who have the most skill sets may not be in your department. And so you develop those relationships. And so we've been able to get relatively immediate access to mental health providers on our campus and be able to refer people at any given time. We've probably got, 5 to more residents who are seeing somebody for something in not necessarily in a suicidal situation, because the whole goal is to hit things before it gets to that point. But for various other activities, things that happen. We most recently, had a resident who was, they had a miscarriage. And I know from experience in the program that can be a very difficult lingering problem. And so we were able to get that person counseling within about 24 hours, get the appointment set up, et cetera, and get that ball rolling. So that's really been the collaboration. I think the other thing is that we have champions within our department. We have a resident whose mother is very involved nationally in suicide prevention and mental health issues. And so she gave a very nice workshop at the Association of Program Directors meeting in one of the lunch breakout sessions. And then she basically replicated that for our department. And so it's been a wide variety of different people. So.
Wonderful. And the thought that, prevention, right, in helping people obtain the tools to better see how they're doing themselves. And I think, Dr. Liberis at UCSF, that collaboration, I think, is fantastic that you're doing that, because I think even just hearing her talk about mindfulness and the resilience training and how residents can really empower themselves to check their own pulse of how am I doing and why am I feeling this way, I think is incredibly powerful. So thank you for sharing that.
The other thing I really want to add is that I think removing some of the stigma of these issues is really key. Our society has a problem where we treat mental illness or depression or these kinds of things as separate from appendicitis or cholecystitis. And what we try to do as a department and a campus is to talk about it a lot and to say, look, it's part of the normal spectrum. It happens to people. There are periods in your lives where you're more stressed than other times. And here are the resources that we have available, and we encourage you to look at it. The other thing that we do is we periodically send out surveys aimed at everyone. Faculty, trainees, everyone, staff, and we just go through some common issues and questions and point them to the resources and say, hey, it is perfectly normal and anonymous to engage these resources.
And thank you for bringing that up. I think what I've heard from a lot of programs in our program as well is that when you have leadership support at the highest level, right, everything kind of trickles down. The culture change starts. What's normal to talk about, is now you open up a whole, array of options for people to actually discuss other parts of their health, their mental health. And so thank you for sharing that. And, the next question is directed at you, Dr. Schulich, as department chair, you touched on this a little bit, but, what compelled you to support this robust wellbeing program for resident surgeons? Kind of what were your goals for this program when it started, and how have these evolved over time?
Yes. So first of all, this is important to me, important to my faculty, my trainees. And I think all great organizations have to think about this and actively do things to improve well-being of their members. And, if you want to look at this from a selfish perspective, and of course I take a much larger perspective than this, but I have a son who's a surgical resident right now. I have a daughter who's in medical school and may, go into a surgery residency or some other type of residency. And I always look at this as, how would I want to be treated? How would I want my family members to be treated? And how would I want the trainees who have been entrusted to our program to be treated? And, these things that we're doing have evolved over time. I really think the most important resource any of us can give is our time, right? Of course, money and space are important, but time is the most important commodity that we have. And, we all have the same amount. We're 24/7, 365. No one gets more, no one gets less. And I think it's incumbent upon us to use some of this time to focus on well-being and to get resources for well-being. And over the years, we used to do a lot of talking about it. We used to, do this or do that sporadically. But now with Dr. Jaiswal's leadership and Dr. Naylor's leadership, and also the leadership of the trainees themselves, we've become much, much better, more comprehensive, and we think about it all the time. And I think, as was stated several times, this is a cultural issue. It is something that you have to work on every day, every minute, and really it's for the betterment of the organization.
Thank you. For all of you, what were some of the biggest hurdles? You mentioned resources, time, finances. There's a big investment that goes into sustaining these initiatives. What were some of the biggest hurdles that you all encountered to kind of get everything established and still now moving forward?
So let me start, and I'll let Dr. Naylor and Dr. Jaiswal throw other things in. But I think the most important barrier to break is to recognize that well-being is important and that we as a group need to invest in it. Once you're there, I think most programs can find resources in terms of personnel. We can find talented leaders, as you see in these two, and you can build it. But if you don't recognize the enormity of the issue, and you don't state, and you don't, as an organization, hold it in high priority, then you can never get anywhere. So I think the first thing is to recognize how important this issue is. And as a residency program, as a training program, we've devoted a lot of resources. We've built up our staff in our academic offices. We've put structure to this with dedicated faculty members, as you can see, that are focused on this. We've built an administrative chief structure where at the upper levels, we have leaders from the training programs that are actively engaged. And not only do they disseminate information, but they actually are active in tailoring the programs or bringing ideas to the table. And, I think it's so important to invest in this.
I think just to add to what Rich said, typically when these programs were rolling out, you would see, at the end of the presentation, a memorial slide to the resident that, committed suicide and that started everything. But I think as a program that's watching that, you have to realize that could be your program. There's not something, to just happen to not be your program. But so understanding that's key, number one, to understand that it's a very important program. I think the other issue is just logistics. I think that was one of the big barriers. So, having busy residents and offering them mental health resources during the middle of the week when they're in the OR and having to do things, you can make that work. But I think one of the transformative things on our campus is when they started offering appointments that were in the evenings, sometimes on the weekends, that were more accessible, increasing the number of slots for trainees. And that was a campus-wide activity. So being much more intentional about working your scheduling around for this group of trainees, because it wasn't just the surgical residents, of course, it was all the other residents as well. And then I think the other thing is taking advantage of all your resources. We have a huge alumni because we're a big program, right? And I have good relationships with them. And so having their contact information, having everybody willing to pitch in. If somebody, for example, the case I talked about with the miscarriage, I've got 2 or 3 alumni who've gone through that, who would be more than willing to talk to this person about how to get through it and what they did. And I know all I have to do is talk to them and ask them, and they'd be drop everything to speak with this resident. And so building that support system, not just within your existing faculty and residents, but also your alumni, I think is another key part of it, because then you have even more resources at your disposal. People who've gone through almost any possible thing you can imagine in residency and can speak about it.
I think one of the biggest challenges in starting a program, so if there's a residency program that's just starting out, the biggest issue, I think, is tackling historical culture, in the sense that many faculty didn't train in that sort of environment. And so getting residents to accept that this is a priority can be difficult. I remember when I first started one of these programs, a resident said, well, I didn't come here to be well. I came here to learn how to operate. And, and now this particular resident is actually quite the champion of resident wellness. And so I think over time, it's sort of like dripping water, and eventually the faucet opens. And I think that continuing to change culture a little bit at a time is really important. And at the beginning, it can be difficult, but I think persistence will reap the rewards.
Thank you all so much. It was it's a breath of fresh air to kind of hear some of these sentiments from you all, the leaders of your program, because, those same hurdles, those cultural shifts, I trained at Stanford as well, as a resident, and, helping organize our very first resident retreat with all residents, doing, an adventure in the Bay Area. Months later, when trying to highlight what we did and why it was valuable, we got feedback from others saying, oh, well, we're going to look like we're a soft program, that Stanford's soft in some ways. And just to know that those were the sentiments at the time. This is now, 7 years ago, but to say, and why is that a negative, right? That we can train fantastic surgeons while still taking care of their mental and emotional health. And it's just wonderful to hear these sentiments. Thank you all for joining us for this important discussion, and huge thanks to Dr. Schulich, Naylor, and Jay Swall for sharing their experience at the University of Colorado. We will have more stories about well-being and resilience this month in upcoming editions of the Bulletin Brief. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time.